Thank you. I have to start by saying I'm feeling a little bit inadequate here. I'm primarily a scientist, and I don't know that I've ever given a talk that refreshed people's souls, but I'm gonna do my best to fit into this theme of this conference. Um, and I'm not sure how the format was yesterday, but if you have questions, you're welcome to just ask them. There's no need to wait till the end. And if I start speaking in jargon that doesn't make sense, you can just kind of go like that, and I'll try to go back and explain what I'm talking about. Um, I'm going to be talking about conservation biology in kids today. I am somewhat unique in my field in that I'm in a wildlife program, and those are the kind of classes I teach, but I study social science, how people interact with wildlife. But until about 5 years ago, I only worked with adults because the idea of working with kids just wasn't something that people in my discipline did. But I connected with a couple environmental educators who did work with kids about 6 years ago and found that it was soul refreshing to work with kids. They had a unique perspective on wildlife, and also when you worked with them, they actually had the ability to change their minds, which as adults we sometimes struggle with. So I'll start just by defining what conservation biology is. The, the discipline is basically one that includes researchers and practitioners who are working to stop extinction. But when you drill down into that, it's protecting individual species and their habitats and ecosystems. And this, I don't know what it's, is that a meme? Anyway, this thing pulled off the internet, it kind of explains what I went through going through college and becoming a conservation biologist. People often think we do very exciting things out in the woods, and last night at dinner I was mentioning that most of my PhD I was in a basement typing, and sometimes in the winter I didn't see the sun. So it was less glamorous. I didn't have a window like this real conservation biologist does. Actually, while I was doing field research for my master's degree, I studied key deer fawns down in the Florida Keys, and I actually had a friend who wanted to come visit me, and I picked him up at the airport, and the first thing he asked me is if we could wrestle alligators. So that really is what people thought. And I said no, and we got in a pickup and with a big radio antenna on it and tracked deer all day. And he was not as impressed by the time he left with my career choices. But why does conservation matter, sort of in a big picture? And this is a kind of typical wheel of things that nature and biodiversity and species provide us as a society. And those sort of valuable things were conceptualized as ecosystem services largely so that efforts to conserve them could sort of talk about value and money, because it was hard to think about why we might, or to justify why we might try to save these species if they didn't have some sort of value that could be traded and compared to money value. And these ecosystem services are typically broken into 4 different parts, with supporting services kind of being the foundation of it all. Without the species that cycle nutrients, that get nitrogen out of the air and put them in the soil so plants can grow, without primary production, the ability to actually grow plants, everything would break down. Once you have those supporting services, you can have provisioning services, which are valuable things that all these species collectively provide us, like the ability to grow our food, to have water cycling through these systems so we have fresh water, wood and fiber and fuel. Throughout a lot of the world, the primary energy source people have is sticks that they burn. Cultural services, actually I'll hit them last, and regulating services. So a lot of things that happen in nature, changes like climate change, would normally sort of get worse and worse. But there are species out there that help dampen those effects. It's called negative feedback. And when you're talking about feedback in an ecosystem, negative is positive. So it keeps things from going crazy and the wheels from coming off. So like in the case of climate change, when you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, it helps plants and algae grow faster, and they take it out of the atmosphere. So those sort of dampening effects are very, very valuable to us. And those same sort of regulating services, there's a big deal made out of them after hurricanes. After Katrina, they found the damage was a lot worse in areas where mangroves and tidal marshes had been removed. My old research days in the Florida Keys, some of the islands that were hit by Irma, you can go down there and look at a place that had mangroves, and they would have had 10 feet of flooding, but the homes are okay. and go to a place that didn't, and there'd be concrete houses that were battered to rubble by the wave action. So those are the regulating services that nature provides. And then the cultural ones are kind of the ones that we value culturally. So nature and species often have spiritual value for us, aesthetic value. It just makes life nicer to have them out there. Educational value, we can learn from nature, and also recreational value. We often enjoy being out with those species. And these are the pieces that are connected to kind of biophilia hypothesis, the idea that we're just happier, better adjusted if we have some species around us other than ourselves and we interact with nature. And I'll be talking about these sort of educational and aesthetic pieces a little bit in more detail. But hopefully this sort of establishes why conservation biology is so important, is because it protects this functioning. And people who study this have argued that some of the species are redundant. So the whole system kind of works, if you could compare it to, say, a car, and you can take pieces off and everything still seems to work, right? If you think about your car, you can yank the tailpipe off, the muffler, and it'll be a little noisier, but it'll still run. You can pull one spark plug out and it'll be even noisier and it won't be quite as fast, but it'll still run. But if you pull the radiator hose off, the engine blows up and it's all over. And so with conservation biology, thinking about saving these species, just in a very pragmatic sense, the idea that we'd let them go is kind of like playing Russian roulette with a revolver that's got 1 million species in it. Eventually, you're going to pull the trigger on the wrong one and everything's going to go to pieces. So it's a very valuable enterprise. So the question is, how are kids involved? And as I said, when I started, I hadn't really thought about this much until recent years. And I think there are two really important ways. One is sort of the aesthetic part, is that for children and for everybody else, our quality of life goes up if we have some ability to interact with nature. And there's a lot of research that establishes that I'm not going to really go into today. And the other is that nature offers tools for learning that are particularly valuable for addressing some of the challenges that educational systems face now. And engaging children can also have mutual gains for conservation biology efforts. And as I was looking at my presentation today, I realized this slide was out of place. It's results from a study we did a few years ago where we did a random sample of 3rd and 5th graders all across the state of North Carolina and asked them, what are your favorite wildlife species? And just list them 1 through 5. And we actually asked them that question, which is what you see here, and we asked them one that was favorite species that live in North Carolina. The difference between those was stark in that the average number of species kids could list that lived in North Carolina was only like 3. So they couldn't even get 5. And then when you look at the sort of worldwide ones, I think one of the trends that was troubling for me as a conservation biologist is these are, by and large, species that kids experience through TV and the internet. It's not our species, which was troubling. But again, this is kind of a non sequitur in my presentation. So hopefully it was interesting. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about how nature can be used to sort of help achieve some of the problems and challenges that education faces and that conservation biologists face. And I will say, as I've got to know this group a little better, I realize some of what I'm talking about is a little sort of age out of step. Most of what I'll be presenting is sort of the K through 12 age range, but I'll leave it to you as experts in pre-K to think about how some of these things may apply. I think there are definitely some parallels. So first I want to share kind of what are these challenges that both educators and conservation biologists are facing. And the first is that in both contexts, there are some large underserved populations, and there are large populations who aren't represented in making those decisions. Since I started in conservation biology in the late 90s, we've made huge strides in terms of gender equity, in terms of researchers and practitioners, and even people who are sort of enjoying the benefits of biodiversity. I did my undergraduate in a wildlife program with 400 students at Texas A&M. So there was about, give or take, 100 in every sort of class. And I was lucky enough to marry one of the 3 women in my class. But if you imagine that dynamic, it was very different than today. Right now, our conservation biology program here at NC State is pretty 50-50, but we still haven't been able to sort of engage in a substantial way, any ethnic minorities in conservation biology. And certainly when you think about education, there's just a long trend of inability to engage all students equally. There are underserved populations that continue to fall behind pretty much irrespective of the interventions that are designed to help address that challenge. Both groups are obviously underfunded. I don't think we need to go into that with education now, given the attention that's been paid to that, and also understaffed. And so these are reasons I think there should be motivation for conservation biologists and educators to work together because they share these similar problems, and using nature can help them address them. And moving to that point of sort of using nature, when we think about challenges that education faces, they're often framed as a capital deficit. And this figure kind of ties back to the figure you saw about ecosystem services. The basic idea is when we think about valuable things we have to achieve our goals, it's not always just cash, right? We have other kinds of capital that are valuable that can help us achieve our goals. And when we're thinking about education or conservation, the biggest ones we often, or categories we use to explain this, are human capital, which is kind of the value of our people, what they can do and what's in their head, right, is very valuable. Financial capital, which again is the cash. Manufactured capital, which are the sort of buildings and gadgets, the iPads and all these kind of things that we have. And social capital, which is the value of our relationships, where if you have long-standing, strong relationships, you can get more done than if you're just new to each other. And then natural capital, which is the value of nature, the things that nature brings to the table that can help us achieve things. I think arguably within education, we've used a lot of these types of capital, and a lot of the sort of interventions that are done when people say, oh, this school or school area is falling behind, we need to save them. We're going to try to provide extra financial capital, send cash to that area, or we're going to try to send special teachers or something to that area, or we're going to give all the students a new laptop, or we're going to do like team building stuff for those schools. These are these other four kind of capitals. And as you can imagine, they're related to each other. It's complex, but it's tricky to rely on them because in all these interventions, it's usually outside resources being pushed in, and they're effervescent. They can go away. And the nice thing about natural capital is you can grow it, and it's there, and it's everywhere. It doesn't respect sort of the channels that money and gadgets follow into schools, right? You can grow gardens anywhere. Globally, if you think about sort of the natural capital associated with, from my perspective, I'm always thinking about wildlife, right? The beasts that are out there. A lot of the poorest places in the world, like Eastern Africa, have the most biodiversity. And even in areas that aren't necessarily particularly rich in biodiversity, like some of the underserved urban schools, you can study nature in terms of biota growing on people's bodies. There are citizen science projects studying mites and things like that that come in on the teachers and the students, right? So it's something that you can grow and that is everywhere. So if we're thinking about how can we sort of leverage natural capital to sort of address these challenges for conservation and for education, some of the benefits on the education side that have already been demonstrated is when you engage kids in nature with teaching, they often have longer attention spans, they have better cognitive and social development, they have lower stress levels. There's been some research showing that underserved students can have catch-up effects. We did some work with Muddy Sneakers, an environmental education group that is statewide now, but was primarily in the mountains, where they take kids out of class, fifth graders out of classrooms 10 days a year minimum, and teach them just in the woods. And we found that particularly for students with IEPs, that doing that helped in terms of behavioral issues and also helped them catch up on like even like science knowledge and stuff by the end of the year. So there could be catch-up effects. And again, as I mentioned before, it can be grown, that capital, something that you don't have to have someone outside the school sort of hand you resources to use. And using natural capital in education is something that really would benefit conservation biology as a discipline and as an effort. First, conservation biology struggles to engage a broad array of people. It's really small compared to education. And if that partnership is forged and conservation biologists use some of their time and resources to help educate, they're going to be brought into an institution that engages pretty much everybody, right? So that's one benefit. Another is tied to that in that education is a much larger enterprise. So there's a lot more going on in education than conservation biology. These are just some stats for the U.S. In 2013, there was $600 billion invested in education, which obviously isn't enough, but during like a 10-year period leading up to that, there was $14 billion globally spent on conservation biology. So it's tying conservation biology to something much larger. Also, by engaging in K through 12 education, conservation biologists can sort of help build pro-conservation attitudes and behaviors among students, this broad constituency, and also find kind of the future leaders for conservation biology without missing them. And then finally, children also provide pathways to parents on ideologically fraught pathways. And we already know that things like gun control and abortion and even climate change have become so ideologically fraught that your political affiliation predicts exactly what you think about it, and there's absolutely no effect of education or information on that, which is unfortunate. But I think what's even more unfortunate is in the last, over time, even things like energy conservation and general environmental conservation have started falling into that trap. And the neat thing for conservation biologists is working with kids provides a pathway to parents that actually works when other pathways don't. Because no matter how crazy we as adults get, we tend to trust our children and we're willing to talk to them about things that we're not willing to talk to other adults about. So if we're thinking, okay, this partnership can help both of us achieve our objectives, kind of what are the next steps? What's the path forward? And I think on the conservation side, we know a lot of the resources that are out there. One of the speakers later, I think, is following this advice. John Connors will be talking about some of these with you, and I think one of our responsibilities is just pointing out what are the resources out there that can be leveraged and used for education, and also helping collaborate with educators on developing curricula, and not just developing curricula, but curricula that address standards. And this is probably more important in the K through 12 context, where teachers are under immense pressure to sort of help their students sort of meet achievement goals on these standards-based tests. And there might actually be some refreshing ability to not worry about this so much in a pre-K level. And also, from a scientist perspective, I think it's important to experimentally evaluate these curricula that are developed to make sure they actually work and achieve the objectives that teachers have. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk about something that's related but different. And this is a research project that we coordinated a couple years ago, looking at what are these sort of experiences related to like the Children in Nature Network, all these things that we want to have children have an experience with when they're young. When we look at fifth graders, which is what this research was done with, the age group, what are their previous experiences in nature that best predict whether they're connected to nature? And the impetus behind this study was just the idea that progressively over time, Americans and children are becoming disconnected from nature, and that has problems, some of which I mentioned in connection with the biophilia hypothesis, the idea that we have, without that connection, we become more stressed, we lose our ability to learn. And to define connection to nature, in the study, it was based on a bunch of questions, but the questions all sort of got at the idea of, do you like nature? That's what the affinity part is. And if you're in nature, do you feel at home? Are you comfortable there, or does it stress you out? And so we had this list of questions that taken together would give you a feel for whether the children enjoyed being in nature and felt at home there, or whether they saw it as sort of a place to be scared and they were stressed out if they were placed in that environment. And various studies on connection to nature have found that youth that have high scores on that tend to move into conservation careers, become environmental activists, and engage in environmental behaviors that we want to promote. And the work on connection to nature has suggested, one, you want to focus on children. And this goes back to the idea that children are in a learning phase and they can change. And two, you want to promote time in nature, the more the better, and alone time. So if you think of some of the programs that you may work in or that you know people do in nature centers, they often have time where kids go out by themselves and think or draw, but they're actually able to do so on their own. But the flip side, and this is where some of the literature becomes a little tricky, is you also want to socialize in nature. That these social interactions help cement the connection people have to it and help it last over time. So in our study, we wanted to look at, well, is alone time in nature, are these alone activities important in building connection to nature, and is social time important? But when we were looking at these, we wanted to know which is the most important. And so what we did is we surveyed this same group of schools throughout the mountains in North Carolina and South Carolina. I tried to avoid statistics for this audience, but I just always have to throw stuff in there. I feel like I'm usually speaking at scientific conferences, and if you don't have a lot of p-values and stuff, people don't believe you at all, and they attack you when you're done. So I'll just say that the group of kids was very similar to what you'd see nationwide in our elementary schools. And we used this fancy kind of analysis that my poor graduate student had to learn that basically takes your group and divides them into subgroups based on their activities using some fancy statistics, but basically the first split is the most important split, and the next split is the second most, and it keeps splitting your group until splits no longer are significant or you're not confident that there's really a difference between groups. And so we started, if you imagine, this is our whole group, and their average connection to nature is a 23 on a scale that's 1 to 50 or whatever, right? And the first split, which indicates the most important thing here, was how much alone time they spent in nature. And if they spent more than the average, they went to sort of that side of the classification tree. If they spent less than the average, they went to the other. And what you see in this big complicated figure here is the blue boxes are where over 3/4 of the students have high connection to nature. They're in the top quartile of connection to nature for the children. And the tan boxes are where you have sort of low connection to nature in the group that ended up there. And so if you don't have much alone time in nature, you've only got one sort of pathway of being a highly connected to nature kid. And that pathway is one that you'd imagine very few children follow, right? Because it means that you go hunting a lot when you're a little kid. You spend a lot of time in nature with your family, and you spend a lot of time socializing in groups out in the woods. So that's one pathway to get to this high connection to nature. The other two are if you spend alone time, a lot of time by yourself out in the woods, and either on one side you go fishing and you go camping as a child, you end up in this high connection to nature group. The other is you don't necessarily fish very much, but you go hiking a lot, and interestingly, you do group sporting activities outside. So that's the one pathway that is sort of not what you think of as just going out and being in nature leads you to be connected to nature. So you can skip over most of this sciencey stuff, but the one thing I would point out is for all of these steps in the tree, we also included a bunch of variables like ethnicity, how old they were, their gender, and none of them were even remotely significant, which for us was good news because a lot of the research in this area imply those variables matter a lot. But when you account for the things kids actually get to do, they kind of go away and don't seem to matter. So some implications of this. One is that if we're trying to help kids connect to nature, we need to start with giving them time alone in nature. And that can be tricky especially in sort of our risk society that we live in, because it's hard to take young children and let them be alone anytime, let alone in nature where we think things are dangerous. And one way, though, to do that is to think of formal programming activities that we can argue are well thought out and people have considered the risks that still emphasize solitary activity for children, and thinking about spaces where that could be done. And I think I just raced through this, and I started 15 minutes early. So I have a ton of time for questions. Hopefully I left enough gaps in my narrative that you'll have some.
Let's start the ball rolling here, okay? Just because this is really interesting, and we're in this. It for sure intersects very strongly with, I think, the major interests in the room here. First of all, you apologize as K-12, but in fact, early childhood generally is defined as 0 through 7 years old. And that's always tricky, right? Because up to 5 years old, children are in some other form of care, and then at 5 years old, the law says they've got to be in school. But from a developmental point of view, we're talking 0 to 7. So, what you're talking about does overlap for sure. And, I think you set some interesting kind of questions that we can talk about. For instance, the definition of nature. The last slide there with the child looking over the hills in, I guess, in North Carolina, western North Carolina. How much nature, and what scale and what, as they say, what dosage do you need for these kinds of connections to take hold of children? And I think our assumption is you don't need that much. And for a 3 or 4 year old or 5 year old, it's literally just a few square yards. If it's rich enough, it can probably, our assumption is it has an effect, right? And then in the case of kids in childcare, it's 5 days a week, most many hours each day. So the exposure is enormous compared to maybe a rather occasional trip, camping. So I think those are interesting questions just to think about in terms of the perspective that you're sharing here. So I'll leave some comments to what I've just talked about to you.
Okay. So my first sort of thought on that set of sort of thoughts and questions is that I definitely agree that just being outside, even in an environment that as an ecologist I might think of as being very degraded, would be very similar to even some of these like more sort of pristine or stereotypical nature environments. And I would definitely agree with that. The work we've done with Muddy Sneakers, we're actually in the process of looking at site wildness and how it relates to this. And I wish I have to look it up and get back to you. I wish I remember, but there was some effects. So for a lot of the things we looked at, like behavior issues, performance on sort of science knowledge at the end of the program, it didn't really matter whether it was taking them to a place like this or taking them to a school proximate, kind of peri-urban, not quite as wild place. But we had the instructors rate the sites they took kids to from sort of like the most pristine possible to the least pristine possible. And we did find some relatively weak but still kind of significant effects in terms of the students' kind of concern about conservation and connection to sort of ownership of natural places. So taking them to places, like this did help in some ways in terms of their local park, like nature parks, feeling an ownership for them and wanting to go back to them and wanting to protect them.
So just one follow-on question, then I'll turn it over to others. Just the whole aspect of restoring nature and how that features in conservation psychology. We know that there's long-standing programs where children care for animals that are some way or another injured, children that have been abused and injured. That would be one extreme end of what I'm talking about, but just restoring nature to especially urban conditions where it's been removed for one reason or another as part of the process that builds the connection back to nature for children. Is that part of what you think about or what shows up in the literature?
Actually, so I would have to comment on that mostly from personal experience and largely with adults rather than children. So I don't know that literature or whether there is some. I would just guess intuitively that if you restore like a watershed or something, it's going to have a profound impact on your connection to it, of whatever age you are. Some of my work with key deer has definitely supported that among adults. After the screwworm infestation that happened there, I don't know if any of you heard about that, but it's a parasite that used to do incredible damage to livestock in the U.S. And we used genetic engineering, or not genetic engineering. They were like sterilized flies to wipe them out from the U.S., but they snuck in to South Florida and got into this endangered deer population. And they actually got locals to volunteer to administer, now I'm blanking on it, whatever asides to kill the worms. And they also, shortly after that with Irma, had volunteers provide water. And the people who got engaged in that have a profound connection to those animals and their conservation and are their biggest advocates, almost to the point where the wildlife refuges and professional conservationists there are struggling because the people who were engaged in that are so adamantly focused on making the well-being of the deer better that they want to provide unnatural supplements and things like that. It's become contentious.
Can you share a little bit about how the kids in the Muddy Sneakers program maybe accessed risk within these natural environments, or whether any attention was given to that?
To their assessment of risk?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't something that we studied, but the graduate student working on it and some of our other collaborators and myself went on some of their trips. And I would say that risk really wasn't a concern of the students. They weren't really scared out in those environments. I would say the sort of big, challenges that the educators had to deal with were more in line with just getting tired of being outside or not wanting to use the restroom outside. So it's a very immersive experience, and they drop them off at this nature area, and they get out of the bus, and they say, you're here until the end of the day. Whatever happens, happens in nature, right? And that can be a challenge to the students. But actually sort of being scared out there it's not really a problem. They don't seem to be worried about it.
Mine doesn't either. I hate microphones, sorry. So I have two questions that are unrelated. One is going back to the, like what type of environment provided that. Is there any research yet on like the aesthetic of environment, even if it's a built environment, like, an enclosed fenced in play area? Does it make a difference whether it's more naturalized or more obviously like human built raised beds, specific planted things versus, again, something with like a more natural aesthetic to it?
So my impression of the literature there is that there's sort of decent research and pretty strong inference for the difference between something that is sort of completely artificial and sanitized and everything else. And that the everything else category works better in terms of some well-being things like stress and also educational things because of the complexity of the somewhat natural environments relative to the completely artificial ones. That distinction, I think, is pretty strong, and there's evidence for it. I don't think there's a lot of work that clearly shows once you get into we're off the rubber mats and metal and plastic toys, once you get from that point to, all the way to we're just playing on a mountainside. I don't think there's a lot there showing what's happening within that domain. It's just sort of the fake versus real.
Okay, sorry. And then my second question is, as far as the increasing programming for solitary activities, like what type of activities? Like reflection, drawing, bird watching, just sitting outside looking at a book? What?
So this is an area that is a little bit new to me. So my experience is largely through Muddy Sneakers, and I think reflection is the main one they do, but they also do drawing and journaling as well, where they'll take them and drop them off and say, either reflect here or journal about what you're seeing and what you think and what you've done, or draw something. Those are the ones I'm most familiar with. But I can imagine if there's probably a lot more out there, because a lot of these sort of small, relatively independent, NGO-driven education centers use this alone time as something that is important to them. Even like Boy Scouts do it in various Boy Scout things.
So it's
so
still
sort of-
supervised. It's still supervised, but the kids feel more with themselves and not like
Right.
talking with other people.
We even thought that that might explain why hunting was sort of the anomaly on the low alone time part, because most forms of hunting in this particular part of the country, even if you go as a group, which you kind of have to if you're a fifth grader or a third grader, you're still kind of alone in your head. It's not something where people are talking and messing around. You're quiet. You're just looking at nature.
I have it's kind of related to what she was asking. So as a conservation biologist, when you come into the Bright Horizons Cary location we were talking about, what would impress you when you come into that center?
So I think I'll answer it from two perspectives. So as a conservation biologist, I think what would impress me would be specific things outside that help connect kids to authentic parts of nature. So we discussed, you had like a inadvertent worm bed with some carpeting you had out there, right? So I think things as simple as that, but also I think things you'll hear about later today, or you've already heard about, like just butterfly gardens where you plant host species that bring particular butterflies in, features that are just wildlife friendly, like a water feature or a forage food feature. Almost any effort would impress me, really, because there's not that much usually. But I would say also from this perspective of a parent, many years ago, my wife and I were kind of shopping around for pre-K centers, and it didn't take anywhere near that much. Just having outdoor play spaces that had some sort of nature that had snuck in, like I'd been talking to a couple people here, like tree branches that poke through the chain link fences, bare soil that's not covered with rubber or something else. I mean, even those kind of things, I think as a parent who personally has a connection to nature and likes having something, wanted my child to have something authentic that they could get into, that was enough to impress me. And we went to centers that their play spaces were either inside or completely artificial, and they had higher state rankings and things like that, and it was pretty scary to us. We left one of them, my wife was crying.
So you're saying anything helps, anything natural helps, and you don't need that much?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. I think that's part of the theme here is that if you put some little elements in, wildlife and nature is going to come in on its own. And that's particularly true in this region of the country. So a lot of people who specialize in restoration ecology kind of look at different regions of the U.S., what you need to do to get native plants and native stuff in. And some places like the desert Southwest, you have to do a lot of work to sort of get nature back. But places like the Southeast, in most cases, all you got to do is take your hands off, and it just comes back on its own. And it's one of our advantages relative to other places in the country.
Hang on a second, Charlie. We're recording this, right? So we want to make sure we've got it on the record. Sorry.
Okay, I was asking about your dealings, if you've had any dealings with parents and convincing them that it's okay for their kids to be in nature, to be outside even.
So, given all the applause there, I'm sad to say that I don't. um, one, one, I guess, comment I'd make on that, and this relates to one of the, sort of my introduction, is that most of my career doing sort of wildlife social science, I worked with adults. And one of the troubling things I found is that it's really hard to change attitudes and values and behaviors of adults. And so it's certainly possible, and people have done different types of outdoor programming that take parents and introduce them to nature in immersive ways, like canoe trips and things like that. And I think there's value there, and it's certainly a lot better than not trying. But I think one of the refreshing things about working with children is that that may be the best way to engage parents. If children become passionate about it and love it, they are, I would say, more successful than other adults are at pulling their parents in.
Now, here's the biggie. We know the children will affect parents. How do we affect policymakers?
So affecting policymakers can be difficult. And I think there are two ways, right? So there are traditional ways through lobbying and grassroots sort of political initiatives, and I think those are great, and they do work in certain circumstances. Some of them have to do with framing, and kids come into that. So I was looking at some literature the other day where there were some efforts in, I think it was Alabama, to have a state tax for biodiversity conservation. And when they initially started the effort, there was they polled, and 75% of the people were opposed to it. And they started an ad campaign that said, you know, save these creatures for our children. It's what's right for our children. And they flipped it from 25% supporting it to 75% supporting it. So doing things for kids is a powerful message in traditional political stuff. I think some of the work that I'm doing with collaborators now, looking at climate change issues, suggests that working with kids might help impact parents in these sort of political contentious issues. We've been doing climate change education stuff in coastal counties, and this year we just got data back. We haven't really done anything with it, but we found that parents of children in the experimental group versus the control group who took normal classes became more concerned about climate change afterwards, even though we were teaching the children about it. But we tried to do it in ways that engaged parents, using interviews, shared service learning projects, and things like that. So I guess engaging kids can be powerful in two ways. One, the sort of dirty political politicking way that we normally do it, and the other is through children being agents of change themselves. Well, not necessarily. I think children can actually, sort of in traditional politics, if you're working, you go out and try to convince someone to vote differently, right? Or you try to convince a legislator to vote differently or do something differently. Or you pay a lobbyist to do that. But the idea with, and on one side, sort of telling the story of kids can be a powerful lever or stick to use in those traditional politics that happen right now. But working with children, they can actually be the person who's doing that instead of other adults. And they can do it right now. They can go home and tell their parents, I've had enough with plastic straws. They need to go away. And then you're not waiting because the parents can vote. And the kids might be a more powerful messenger for that message than me. Well, they are.
I think you kind of just answered it, but to piggyback on what you were saying, like, so I taught at a center 4- and 5-year-olds, and all behind us, we had forests and everything, but then you know, typical around this area right now, it was knocked down and they're building a car wash. And that was like devastating to my kids. But so I was going to ask, like, and that's happening all around Raleigh right now. So do you just continue to talk about that to them? Like, because you just said, like, they are our most powerful voices. So how do you, you know, like, how do you talk about that? Because it's happening everywhere I look nowadays. Stuff's getting knocked down for buildings to be built up. So do we talk about that? Because I did. I'm just wondering. But, I mean, they had a ton of, it was devastating for them, I feel.
So I would first respond to that by saying, your opinion is probably better than mine. It's totally out of my wheelhouse, but it seems like that certainly would be a learning opportunity, right? This is something that children valued, that was part of their world, and it's an opportunity to talk about the decisions we make in terms of community planning, right? I mean, maybe there has to be a car wash somewhere. Maybe there's a place that's better. Maybe there's a place that's worse. So it's definitely a learning opportunity, I think.
I have a follow-up comment to your question. I think children are very, very intelligent. And so I think one can describe the situation, show the options without judgment. And they will make their own judgments, and we like it or not, or, you know. But I think we need to allow them to have the facts and not to, you know, be blind to what's happening around us, but get the facts and allow an opportunity for a conversation.
So I would follow up on that, because that's actually one of the most exciting things we've done lately. Is there was I think it was a nationwide study that looked at science teachers and climate change, and they found out that the same proportion of science teachers thought it was kind of a hoax as the proportion of the general public. And I think it was published in Nature Climate Change, and people were wringing their hands like, oh my goodness, the science teachers aren't any different, and this message is out to our kids, right? But we had a study going on at the same time that just by luck, we had asked teachers of the students we were working with, do you think anthropogenic climate change is real, and is it a risk to people? And we found, just like the other study, that it was about the same as the general public in terms of whether they thought that, but it had no bearing on what the kids thought in the classes. So what predicted what the kids thought was whether the teacher taught anything about climate change. If the teacher taught it, the kids thought it was real, it was caused by people, and it was a problem we need to deal with. So building on that comment, kids are smart, and because they don't have all this ideological baggage, if you give them the facts, they're going to come to some pretty astute conclusions about what needs to be done.
Two questions. The first one is, do you know did Muddy Sneakers follow up and find out if any of the children brought their parents out to where they visited?
Sort of. So they work with these kids in 5th grade, and then they kind of move on, and they typically don't see them again. But they're working with, or they just finished working with a senior at one of the high schools they worked at, to sort of do a retrospective survey to find out if kids went back to the parks that they were introduced to and did stuff there with their families, and also whether the kids were more interested in science careers and some other stuff. And I don't know the answers yet. But this is their first look at it. And I think last year was the first year that they had sort of kids from their original programming that were exiting high school.
The second question is kind of looking at the animal chart you had with what children identified as their favorite animals. So we're outside all the time, and I don't know if the children bore of, you know, learning about what's available locally and the animals they see, and they really want to learn about dinosaurs or, you know, the fastest big cats and things like that. Do you feel that's appropriate to bring in, or should we be focusing on what we have available to us as far as like natural thing, you know, biodiverse areas outside of where we are?
So I don't think it's bad that kids love lions and tigers and zebras, right? They're cool animals, and the landscapes that they live in are valuable landscapes that aren't going to be protected realistically now unless there's a global interest in them. So I think that's great. But I think basically a message from that is we need to do more to help them make those same connections and have those same values for the biota that's just around them, that they live with, that their kids will eventually live with, what we're passing on here in place.
This is really more of a kind of an observation or a comment than a question, but I was really fascinated by the research showing that children really needed this alone time. And I know that in early childhood in particular, we're all like freaking out because you got to see them all the time. Got to always be able to see them, right? So two thoughts about that. One is, are there ways for us to make opportunities for children, even though we may be on the play space and we need to be able to see them? Two thoughts about this. One is this is an opportunity for outdoor classroom time, not outdoor playtime, but outdoor classroom time, to send your children out into the play space and ask them to, find a quiet spot and spend some time alone and not be playing and not be working on anything in particular, but just maybe just lying down on the ground and looking at the clouds or looking into the grass to see what they can see or just having a moment by themselves and really setting that up for them, that opportunity for them on a regular basis so that they can have those moments alone. And then the other thought that came to me about this is at the same time we're trying to, many of us are trying to create all the same centers outdoors that we have indoors in the classroom so that we can take class outside all day long or as often or as much as we possibly can. And here's another opportunity to create the cozy. We're all supposed to have cozy in our classrooms, right? As part of ECHRS. And so how can we create cozy in the outdoor learning environment? It may be hammocks, it may be keyhole gardens, it may be quiet corners, little nooks, places where children can also seek that cozy when they're on the play space that they may seek when they're in the classroom and they need that comforting inside. So just something to take back and think about.
I just say that's a great thought. And that's what we're hoping is that people will figure out how to make this alone time more effective and make it something that's doable.
Do we have to call it cozy? As a child, I laid out in the grass and tried to find a four-leaf clover, and I was left to my own device. Alone time means just that. Don't inflict upon me your idea of what I'm supposed to be doing. And until we give some freedom in early childhood, we're going to keep getting what we've been doing and getting. It's time for a change, folks.
So I just want Nils to ask you, please, bring your research to this age, to infants and toddlers. I think they have the solution. They can tell you the solution. They can tell us the solution.
Well, I was just discussing with some of the staff at the center that I'd love to get engaged with the pre-K age.
Oh,
so we'll have to figure out a way to do it.
We have many friends here.
Okay, one more comment over there, and I have just a closing comment.
Just to add on to everything that was pretty much said in the last 5 minutes. I'm a toddler teacher, and I know that just from observation and just knowing my kids and being out in nature and stuff like that, the most peaceful I've seen them is when I am able to step back, leave them alone, observe them. And, the simple social implication, as you stated, is super important. But you know, the cozy, the time where they can just dig in the dirt with their hands and I leave them alone, you know, like they are so in their zone and peaceful, and they're creating their own learning experience and they're creating their own thoughts, and it's just really beautiful. So I'm really glad that was brought up.
One of the main things is we have kids in schools 5 days a week, mostly 8 to 10 hours a day, and they get 60 minutes outside if we don't have outdoor classrooms. And that's just amazing. I mean, you think about the cozy spaces, leaving them alone. Most of the time, we want, teachers to be engaged fully, but they get, they need 45 minutes to have executive function development. And that's one of the things where you really want their brain and their social skills to come up. And, just think about the ways that you can allow them to have that 60 minutes alone and let them do their thing. And, if you're going to have more time outside, which is one thing that we push, 90 minutes, 120 minutes, trying to get more time outside. But, there's a place for teacher engagement, but there's also a place for, just letting them be.